Hi, I'm glad you're here. Today's story isn't your typical pirate tale. There are no parrots, no treasure maps, and definitely no Hollywood endings. Instead, we're diving into the real history, the dark, violent, unbelievable truth about the women who ruled the seas. Women who weren't just surviving in a man's world, they were dominating it. One of them built a pirate empire so powerful that nations had to kneel. Another walked away from everything she knew and fought her way into legend. And the third, she died with a sword in her hand and fire in her chest. This is a story about rebellion, about strategy, about identity. But more than anything, it's about women who refuse to disappear quietly. Welcome to True Crime Echoes, and this is the story of the pirate queens you were never supposed to know. Chapter 1. Not all pirates had beards. When we think of power, real power, the kind that shapes nations, ends empires, rewrites history, our minds tend to go straight to kings, emperors, maybe even a couple of notorious dictators. You know the usual suspects. Men in robes or uniforms holding swords or scepters making big decisions from their thrones or war rooms. But that's not the whole story. Because for centuries there was another kind of ruler, one that didn't answer to any kingdom or government. Someone who didn't wait for permission to take power. They didn't build empires with laws and politics. They built them with cannons and fear. I'm talking about pirates. Now, I'll be honest. When I first started digging into the history of piracy, I was expecting a lot of rum wooden legs parrots on shoulders. You know, the whole Pirates of the Caribbean fantasy. And I definitely assumed most of them were men. Because that's what we're taught, right? Every history book, every movie, every Halloween costume. Male pirates, dirty, drunk, violent, and very male. But then I came across something unexpected. Some of the most successful, brutal, and powerful pirates in history were actually women. Not sidekicks, not legends, spun out of myths, real women, with real swords, real fleets, real blood on their hands. And they didn't just survive in a man's world, they dominated it. And the craziest part, I had never heard of them before. Why don't we know their names? Why are they footnotes? If they're even mentioned at all, when their stories are just as wild, just as terrifying, and honestly way more complicated than their male counterparts. That's what this episode is about. Because once I started reading about them, I couldn't stop. The audacity, the strategy, the violence, it was all there. But there was also desperation, intelligence, loyalty, betrayal, survival. These weren't just pirates. These were women who refused to play by society's rules because those rules were never made to protect them in the first place. So today I'm sharing their stories, two of them to be exact. One of them built an empire so big that she literally terrified multiple governments into a peace treaty. The other, she burned every bridge in her life for the man she loved, and then risked everything again for a woman she trusted. Both of them wielded power not because it was handed to them, but because they took it. This isn't just about ships and battles and treasure, though. Don't worry, we've got plenty of that too. It's about women who lived in the margins and still found a way to change history. It's about rage and ambition, about love and war, and about what happens when a woman with nothing to lose realizes just how dangerous that makes her. Let's begin. Chapter 2. Blood on the Water. So let's set the scene. Before we dive into swords and mutinies and naval battles, I want to talk about the world these women were born into. Because you can't really understand a pirate until you understand what they were running from and what they were fighting against. Let's start with the late 1700s. In China during this time, society was chaotic to say the least. Between 1750 and 1800, the population exploded like we're talking from 180 million to nearly 300 million people. That's like adding an entire second country into the same space. There were simply too many people and not enough land, not enough food, not enough opportunity. Families were living in poverty in overcrowded cities, and many of them were forced to live on boats because there was literally nowhere left on land to go. They were known as the Tanka people, boat dwellers, fisher folk, outsiders. They weren't even considered fully human by the ruling elite. They were banned from owning land or participating in many areas of mainstream society. And that right there is where one of our stories begins. A girl was born into that chaos. Her name was lost to history, but we would come to know her as Ching Shih. Now here's the thing, Ching Shih wasn't born into a life of power. She didn't inherit a pirate legacy. She wasn't some royal rebel. She was born into poverty, into a marginalized class, and into a system where her life was supposed to be invisible. Her options basically none. So she made her own. Like many women from the Tanka community, she ended up working in a floating brothel, a sex worker on a ship selling her body to survive. And yeah, it sounds grim. It was grim. But here's where things start to get interesting, because Ching Shih wasn't just surviving, she was watching, listening, learning. According to multiple historical accounts, she used her position to gather secrets. Men, especially powerful ones, tend to say too much when they feel like they're in control. And she paid attention. She didn't just sell sex, she sold information. Traded it, leveraged it, used it like a weapon. And in doing so, she quietly started building something that most women in her position never even dreamed of influence. She also protected other women in her profession. This part gets me every time. Instead of hoarding her power, she used it to warn men that if they harmed any of the sex workers she worked with, she would destroy them by leaking their dirtiest secrets. And let's be real, men in power always have dirty secrets. By the time she hit her 20s, she was already feared, respected, and completely underestimated. Then she met a man. Of course. His name was Zheng Yi, a pirate captain from a long line of pirates. But this wasn't some romantic fairy tale. This was a partnership, a business arrangement. Zheng Yi saw her value not just as a lover, but as a strategist, a negotiator, a force. And she saw his name as a vehicle for even more power. They got married. And with that, she became Ching Shih, literally widow of Zheng. Together they were unstoppable. But make no mistake, Ching Shih wasn't just playing the supportive wife role. She was co-running pirate operations, plotting which towns to raid, which ships to attack, which captives to ransom or recruit. She wasn't just on the ship, she was steering the empire. And then came the next move, a big one. They kidnapped a 15-year-old boy named Chung Po Tsai. He was forced into piracy like many others during that time, and eventually he became, well, more than just a crew member, more than a son. He became her right hand. Some say he became her lover, maybe both. The records are vague and contradictory, but either way, he was loyal to her, completely. And loyalty in Ching Shih's world was everything. After Zheng Yi died suddenly in 1807, some say in battle, others claim it was a storm, everyone assumed the pirate fleet would collapse. Because in those days, when a man died, so did his wife's social status, her power, her identity. But not Ching Shih. She stepped in, gathered her late husband's allies, and said, "I'm not going anywhere. You can follow me or you can lose your heads." And they followed her. Because they knew, just like we're learning, now she wasn't just the widow of a pirate king, she was the empire, and the sea was hers. Chapter 3, The Pirate Queen's Law. So, now we've got this woman, Ching Shih, who went from being a sex worker on a floating brothel to commanding the most powerful pirate fleet in history. And I mean that literally. Not romantically, not metaphorically. She was in charge of over 70,000 pirates and nearly 400 ships. Let that sink in for a second. That's more than the size of some national navies at the time. And remember, this was during the Qing dynasty, a massive empire. Yet Ching Shih wasn't just surviving alongside them, she was defying them. Successfully. And here's what really blows my mind. She didn't maintain that kind of power through brute force alone. She used structure. She used rules. She brought order to an entire world that was built on chaos. Because here's the thing about pirates. They were independent, they were violent, and they definitely didn't like being told what to do. You'd think the last thing a pirate would ever want is a set of laws. But Ching Shih, she understood human nature. She understood greed. She understood betrayal. And she understood that no army, no matter how ruthless, survives long without unity. So she created a pirate code. Yeah, a literal code of conduct. And it wasn't symbolic. These were hard, brutal rules with consequences. Final ones. Let me give you a few examples. Rule number 1: don't steal from your fellow pirate. If someone else looted it, it's theirs. Period. If you got caught pocketing a little extra gold that didn't belong to you, that was a death sentence. No warnings, no negotiations, you were decapitated. Rule number 2: respect the villagers. Now this one surprised me. If a town was raided and any local person cooperated or helped the pirates in any way, they were off limits. Anyone who hurt, robbed, or abused a supportive villager was also executed. No exceptions. Rule number 3, and this one. This one was ahead of its time. No sexual assault. At all. Women taken during raids were to be unharmed. If a pirate wanted to be with a woman, he had to marry her. And if he tried anything without her consent, yep, death. Again. It's shocking, I know, especially considering how many stories we've heard about pirates being the exact opposite of that. But that's what makes her reign so fascinating. Ching Shih didn't just want power, she wanted control. And she understood that fear was only effective when it was backed by structure, when people knew exactly where the line was and what would happen if they crossed it. Honestly, it makes me think, maybe this is why women make better villains, or maybe better leaders, because when we're forced to fight for power, we don't waste it, we don't throw it around recklessly, we make it count. And here's the wildest part. Her rule book. It actually worked. Morale in her fleet was high. Loyalty was strong. The men respected her not just because they feared her, but because she ran things better than any man ever had. And that made her dangerous. Not just to rival pirates, but to governments. See, it wasn't just petty pirate crews she was up against. By 1808, the Chinese Navy had declared open war on her. And when I say Navy, I'm talking thousands of trained soldiers, military ships, full-on national power. But even then, they couldn't take her down. In one legendary standoff, the Chinese Navy, with help from the Portuguese, spent 3 months trying to destroy Ching Shih's fleet. They fired at her from all sides. They tried to burn her out, starve her, drown her, and somehow, she slipped through, survived. No capture. No surrender. It was after that battle, bloody, exhausting, and relentless, that something changed. Not in her enemies, in her. Because if you look closely, you can almost sense the shift. She wasn't just thinking like a pirate anymore. She was thinking like a strategist, a businesswoman, a politician. She'd built the empire. Now, she was figuring out how to exit it. Because sometimes the most powerful move a woman can make is knowing when to walk away without leaving a trace. And, believe me, Ching Shih wasn't done making history just yet. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Beat an Empire. There's this moment in every great crime story where things shift. The rise is over, the empire's built, the enemies are circling, and the only question left is how does it all end? For most pirates, the answer is obvious. It ends in blood, in chains, in some public square with a crowd cheering while someone tightens a noose. That's just how the story usually goes. But not for Ching Shih. She didn't get caught. She didn't go down in some blaze of glory. She didn't disappear in the middle of the night, never to be heard from again. She walked into the government's office on her own and negotiated her freedom. What let me back up? By 1809, things were getting out of hand. Ching Shih's fleet had become so powerful, so organized, and so completely unstoppable that the Chinese government was in full-blown panic mode. They'd tried fighting her multiple times. They'd teamed up with Portuguese and British forces to try and wipe her out, and every time she came back stronger. But after years of war, even Ching Shih started to realize this couldn't go on forever. She was aging. She'd spent her entire adult life fighting and commanding and surviving, and honestly, maybe she was tired. So she made a decision that no one saw coming. She sent word to the government. She was willing to negotiate. Now here's where things get bold. Because when she showed up to that negotiation, she didn't come crawling. She didn't beg. She didn't even apologize. She walked in like a businesswoman, like a boss. And she laid out her terms. She would disband her fleet. Her pirates would surrender. And this is a big, but they would all be pardoned. No prison, no executions. And she would get to keep her money, her name, and her dignity. And the craziest part, the government said yes. Why? Because at that point, they had no other option. They couldn't beat her, and they knew it. Trying to take her down by force had only made her stronger. If they wanted the pirate war to end, they had to let her go. So just like that, she retired. No exile, no trial, no scandal. She took her wealth, which by the way was massive, and used it to open a tea house. A literal tea house. Can you imagine that? You walk into this quiet little shop on the coast, and the woman serving you tea used to command the most terrifying pirate army in history. It's poetic and kind of surreal. She lived out the rest of her life in peace. Died in 1844 at the age of 69. On paper, her obituary just says she was the widow of a military officer. But anyone who really knew her story, they knew better. She wasn't just someone's wife. She wasn't just a pirate. She was a leader, a strategist, a survivor, a woman who broke every rule that tried to contain her and then rewrote her own ending. And honestly, I can't stop thinking about that, because Ching Shih didn't just beat the men who tried to control her. She didn't just beat rival pirates or corrupt officials or foreign navies. She beat the system. She played the long game and she won, not with brute strength, not with some dramatic last stand, but with intelligence, patience, and power that couldn't be denied. There's something really powerful about that, something that sticks with you. Because in a world that expected her to go down in flames, Ching Shih built her own exit ramp and walked away untouched. Most pirates die legends. She lived long enough to become one. Chapter 5: Fire and Fury. If Ching Shih was all about strategy and survival, then Bonny was the opposite. She was fire. She was fury. She was rebellion in human form. Where Ching Shih built an empire and walked away from it like a chess grandmaster, stepping back from the board, Anne lit her world on fire and dared anyone to stop her. And from the very beginning, she wasn't supposed to exist. Anne was born in Ireland sometime in the late 1600s, but her birth wasn't exactly celebrated. She was the result of an affair. Her father was a wealthy lawyer, and her mother his maid. And back then, that was a full-blown scandal, like life-ruining scandal. To cover it up, her father did something wild. He dressed baby Anne as a boy, gave her a fake name, Andy, and passed her off as his legitimate son. This went on for years. Think about that, growing up in hiding, performing a gender and identity that was never really yours all, because the truth was too shameful for the adults around you. That messes with a person. Eventually, the lie unraveled like they always do, and the family fled to the Americas to escape the fallout. They ended up in what's now South Carolina. Her father tried to rebuild his reputation, but Anne, she was already lost to that world. She didn't want a prim, polished life. She didn't want to be anyone's daughter or wife or secret. She wanted freedom, whatever that meant to a teenage girl raised on lies. And yeah, she was angry. Angry at her father, angry at the world, angry at being told how she was supposed to behave, dress, talk, sit, smile. So when she met a man named James Bonny, a low-level pirate, she didn't hesitate. She married him just to piss off her father. And it worked. Her father disowned her, cut her off completely. Some people say Anne got so mad she burned his plantation to the ground. Honestly, I wouldn't put it past her. But James, he wasn't the swashbuckling pirate she'd probably fantasized about. He turned out to be kind of a dud, not particularly brave or bold or anything, really. Eventually, he sold out. Literally. He started working with the British governor in the Bahamas, giving up names of other pirates in exchange for money. Anne had married a snitch. And for someone who believed in freedom above all else, that was unforgivable. She started hanging out in pirate bars, slipping away into the shadows, listening to stories from real outlaws. And that's where she met Calico Jack. Now he was the kind of pirate you read about, loud, cocky, reckless. The kind of man who swaggered when he walked, who flirted like he meant it, who commanded respect, even when he was drunk off rum. And Anne. She was obsessed. This wasn't just some crush. This was two people who saw something in each other, a shared hunger for danger, for escape, for more. Jack wanted Anne. Anne wanted a new life. So she left her husband and ran away with the pirate king of the Caribbean. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Women weren't allowed on pirate ships. It was considered bad luck. So Anne once again disguised herself as a man. She bound her chest, wore loose clothes, spoke like a sailor. And nobody suspected a thing. Not at first. But she didn't just survive as a pirate. She thrived. She fought, she raided, she cursed louder than the men around her. Eventually, Jack revealed her true identity to the crew, and to their surprise, they didn't care. She'd already proven herself. She wasn't a girl playing dress-up. She was a pirate, and that would have been enough to make her legendary. But then, she met someone who changed everything. Another man on the ship who, like Anne, wasn't a man at all. Her name was Mary Reed, and their connection. That's something I'll get into next, but just know this Anne Bonny didn't just run away from the life she was given. She burned it down. And what she built with her bare hands in blood, in storm and secrecy, would become one of the most infamous love stories and pirate partnerships in history. Chapter 6: The Pirate and the Ghost. There's something haunting about finding someone who reflects your own darkness back at you. For Anne Bonny, that person was Mary Reed. Now the story of how they met reads like a novel. Anne was already deep into pirate life at this point, fighting alongside Calico Jack, raiding ships, hiding her true identity from the world, and let's be honest, probably from herself too. She'd already torn herself away from everything she knew, from her family, her husband, her old life. She was living entirely outside the law, disguised as a man on a ship full of criminals. That kind of life, it isolates you. But then came Mary. She joined the crew under the name Mark Reed. Everyone believed she was a young man, same disguise, same deception Anne had pulled off. Except something about Mark felt different to Anne. Maybe it was a glance that lingered too long, or a softness in a voice that was supposed to be hard. Maybe it was intuition. Or maybe Anne just recognized something in her, something only a woman pretending to be a man could spot in another. Whatever it was, Anne confronted her, quietly, privately, and that's when the truth came out. Mark was Mary, just like her. Two women, both disguised, both on the run, both fighting for the right to exist in a world that had never made space for them. It must have felt like finding a ghost who knew your name. Their bond became instant, powerful, and yeah, intimate. A lot of historians debate whether they were lovers. Some say yes, others say they were just close friends. Honestly, I don't think the label matters. What matters is that they found each other, two women who had clawed their way into a man's world and refused to let go of it. They trusted each other with their lives, and in the brutal world of piracy, that kind of trust was everything. Of course, their closeness didn't go unnoticed for long. Jack Calico. Jack started getting suspicious. He thought Anne was cheating on him. With a man. Ironic, right? The same woman who had once risked everything to be with him was now doing the same thing again, only this time for someone he thought was a rival. There's a story, probably half legend, half truth, that Jack stormed into Mary's cabin one night, ready to kill her out of jealousy, knife in hand, rage in his eyes, and Mary. She didn't flinch. She just ripped open her shirt and revealed the truth: she was a woman. I wonder what went through Jack's head in that moment. Shock, relief, confusion. Maybe all of it, maybe none of it. Either way, he let her live. And from then on, the three of them became something like a team. A strange, volatile, incredibly effective team. Anne and Mary fought side by side, led raids, tortured prisoners, burned villages. They were fearless, ruthless, and together they were unstoppable. There's a quote from a surviving prisoner who described them as more bloodthirsty than the men, and I don't think that was an exaggeration. Because for Anne and Mary, this wasn't just about treasure or glory. This was survival. Every day on that ship was a rebellion. Every sword they drew was a middle finger to the world that said they didn't belong. And they knew it couldn't last forever. They were burning bright, too bright. But for that brief moment on the deck of a stolen ship under the open Caribbean sky, they were everything the world told them they couldn't be. Free. Chapter 7: Fall of the Black Flag. Freedom has a price, and for Anne Bonny and Mary Read, that price came knocking in the fall of 1720. By this point, their reputation was out of control. They weren't just pirates, they were legends. Whispers spread from port to port about the women on board the William Calico Jack's ship. Some said they were demons, some said they were sirens, and others just called them dangerous. Whatever the label, one thing was clear: they were wanted. And not in the romantic, rebellious way. There was now a literal price on their heads. The British governor of the Bahamas was fed up. The colony had become a pirate playground, and Jack's crew, with Anne and Mary at the helm, was responsible for raid after raid, town after town, ship after ship. So a warrant went out, not just for Jack, but for all of them: Anne, Mary, every name, every soul. And one night, it all came crashing down. They were docked in a harbor, anchored quietly, probably celebrating another successful haul. But they got too comfortable, too drunk, too loud. They didn't see the storm coming, not in the clouds, but in the form of a government ship loaded with soldiers armed to the teeth. By the time the warning reached the crew, it was too late. The British Navy boarded the William with guns drawn, and most of the crew, including Jack, did absolutely nothing. They were passed out, hiding, terrified. But not Anne, and not Mary. There's something tragic and beautiful about that image: two women standing alone on a ship, weapons drawn, screaming at the men around them to fight, to do something. And when no one answered, Mary fired into the hold. She literally shot at her own crewmates. Not to kill them, though one man did die, but to shock them, to wake them up, to remind them that cowards die quietly, and that wasn't how she planned to go out. But even rage and loyalty and fire weren't enough to stop what was coming. They were outnumbered, outgunned, out of time. Anne and Mary fought like hell, but eventually they were captured, shackled, dragged to jail. And then came the trials. One by one, the men of the William were sentenced to death, Calico Jack included. He was hanged within weeks. Anne never visited him in prison, but she sent him a message. She said, "If you'd fought like a man, you wouldn't be hanging like a dog." Brutal. And honestly fair? Then it was Anne and Mary's turn to face the court. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses, testimonies, pirate codes violated. No one expected them to survive the trial, especially not as women. Their crimes were clear, and the court wasn't interested in mercy. The sentence was death by hanging. But then they did something that no one saw coming. They both pleaded their bellies. It was an old legal term. Basically, they claimed they were pregnant. And under English law at the time, you couldn't execute a woman carrying a child. And so their lives were spared. For now. And that's where their paths split for good. Mary died in prison. Illness, probably. Maybe heartbreak. Maybe exhaustion. No one really knows. But Anne vanished. There are no clear records of her execution, no burial, no public death. Just silence. Some say she escaped, that her wealthy father pulled strings to bring her back to South Carolina, that she remarried, had children, and lived a quiet life, never speaking a word about her past. Others believe she died in that prison cell, her name forgotten, her story erased. But I don't know. Something tells me that Bonny wasn't the type to go quietly. I like to believe she got away, that she found some quiet coast, changed her name, and sat on a porch in old age, watching the waves, remembering the feel of wind in her hair and a sword at her side. Because even if the flag came down, the fire never really went out. Chapter 8. Echoes of the Storm. When I first started digging into the stories of Ching Shih, Anne Bonny, and Mary Red, I thought I was just going to learn about pirates. You know, gold, gunpowder, wooden ships, the usual swashbuckling drama. But what I found was something else entirely. These weren't just outlaws. They were women standing in the middle of systems that were never built for them. And instead of bending to survive, they broke the rules and then built new ones. Think about it. Ching Shih went from being sold into sex work to commanding the largest pirate fleet in history. Not just leading it, but organizing it, structuring it, sustaining it for years. She didn't die in battle. She wasn't executed. She retired, peacefully, rich, respected. She negotiated with one of the most powerful governments in the world, and won. That's not just rare. That's nearly impossible. And then there's Anne and Mary. Two women born into worlds that tried to erase them before they even had a chance. Anne grew up being hidden lied about, punished for simply existing. Mary was passed around between war's jobs disguises, and both of them realized that if they wanted to live freely, they would have to disappear, not physically, but socially. They had to become someone else just to move through the world, to be heard, to be seen. So they put on pants, bound their chests, spoke like men, fought like men, killed like men. But they weren't trying to be men. They were trying to survive as women in a world that punished them for existing on their own terms. And I keep coming back to this thought. How many women throughout history had to vanish in order to live? How many lives were rewritten, reshaped, renamed, just to avoid being burned, buried, or forgotten? It's easy to romanticize pirates now. We turn them into Halloween costumes, movie franchises, Instagram aesthetics. But for these women, piracy wasn't a fantasy, it was freedom. And not the kind you toast to with champagne. It was messy, brutal, and dangerous. But it was theirs. They didn't have the luxury of playing it safe. And honestly, they didn't want it. They wanted more even if it meant dying for it. And here's the truth that keeps echoing for me. Power doesn't always look like a crown or a throne. Sometimes it looks like a woman at the helm of a stolen ship, staring down an empire with nothing but grit and cannon smoke. Sometimes it looks like two women in disguise choosing each other over the lives they left behind. Sometimes it's just surviving long enough to tell your story your own way. We don't know exactly how Anne died, or where Mary was buried. We don't know the real name of Ching Shih, but we do know they lived. And they didn't just live. They fought, they ruled, they changed history. They were feared, respected, remembered. And in a world that tried to silence them, that is the loudest legacy of all. So, what do we do with stories like these? Do we rewrite history to make space for the women who were written out of it? Or do we leave them where we found them, tucked between footnotes and folklore? Personally, I think stories like these deserve to echo loudly. Because Anne, Bonny, Mary Read, and Ching Shih didn't just defy the odds, they redefined them. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for acceptance. They made space where there was none. And while their names might not be in the textbooks, they live on, in whispers, in legends, in every woman who refuses to shrink to fit the world around her. If this story moved you or surprised you or made you think, let me know. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or just say hi. I'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. Because on this channel, we tell the stories that echo through time, the dark, the hidden, the nearly forgotten. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay curious and stay bold.